Join Boise State Public Radio for a concert with blues rock guitarist and vocalist Coco Montoya at the Treefort Music Hall in Boise, February 13th, with reserved seating. A night with Coco Montoya and his band. Find details and a link for tickets at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you up to date on the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes Drew Dodson, editor and reporter for the Valley Lookout, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, and Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun. It is a full house today. Happy Friday, everybody, on this snowy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Friday.
Well, let's start at the State House. Logan, currently, Idaho's primary method of execution for prisoners who have been convicted to death is lethal injection. However, there is a House Bill 37, that would change that. Can you start out by telling us about this bill?
Absolutely. For a little bit of background, Idaho currently has 9 individuals on death row. These are people who've been convicted, and the courts have found that the appropriate punishment for their crime is to be put to death. The state of Idaho has largely used lethal injections to carry this out. But we've also seen nationwide where over the last decade plus, there have been, it's become more difficult for states to obtain these lethal injection chemicals. They're not technically medicine, so they don't fall under other sorts of legal areas. And it's also just become difficult for the state to do these lethal injections as well. Listeners may remember last year, the last time the state tried to carry out a lethal injection execution, they were unsuccessful. They weren't able to establish this IV line. So before that unsuccessful execution, lawmakers had amended state law to allow firing squad as a secondary method in the case that the state couldn't get their hands on these chemicals. But now, after the unsuccessful execution, when the state did have chemicals in their possession, lawmakers are looking to flip that order around and make it so firing squad is the main method with lethal injection as a secondary method if needed.
Okay, so Logan, what happens next with this House bill?
The House bill has passed the House, which means it is going to go over to the Senate. It will likely be assigned to the Senate Judiciary Senate Judiciary Committee for a hearing. And if they approve it, it would go on to the full Senate. If approved by the Senate, it would go to Governor Little.
Okay. Drew, first, welcome to the Friday Reporter Roundtable, where we love having you, and we're looking forward to all of the news coming out of Valley County with Valley Lookout. With that said, a big story coming out of Valley County, this is the fact that the Donnelly Public Library, along with students and librarians and parents, and even some of the world's largest publishing companies, are suing the state of Idaho. Can you refresh our memories about a law that went into effect that led to this lawsuit?
Absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me, Gemma. You're thinking of House Bill 710. It was passed by the Idaho legislature last April and signed into law by Governor Little. And essentially, the law is it's what some would say a book banning bill. It requires all libraries to establish a complaint process for books that are deemed harmful to minors and to take reasonable steps to restrict access to any books fitting that criteria. And when we say harmful to minors, we're mostly referring to sexual content, acts of homosexuality. That tends to be what the language in the bill focuses on. And so, yeah, that took effect on July 1st. And since then, libraries across the state have kind of been grappling with what that means and how to deal with that. And in many cases, it means something different for different libraries.
Mm-hmm. So with that said, Drew, tell us about this lawsuit that was recently filed in U.S. District Court.
Absolutely. So it's at its core, it's kind of a free speech lawsuit, I'd say. It's centered on the First Amendment. And that is to say that these large publishing companies, the Donnelly Library, authors, parents, students, believe it's a free speech violation for these books to be either removed from library shelves or have access limited to them. And so I think, with Donnelly specifically, obviously that's kind of my focus. I live here in Donnelly. And I think it's kind of a case of opportunity meets circumstance because last summer, the Donnelly Library, in response to 710, adopted an adults only policy where anyone under the age of 18 would not be allowed in the library without a parent or guardian. They
Mm-hmm.
eventually came up with a waiver policy for that, and that kind of helped mitigate that to some degree. But nonetheless, this adults only policy made nationwide news. It moved a lot of people, so much so that the library actually received over $5,000 in donations from people across the country,
Wow.
Missouri, Virginia, Maryland, people who were so moved by this story that they wanted to help, that they wanted to contribute to this expansion campaign that the Donnelly Library has going on. Because a lot of people don't know this, the library is contained within a 1,000 square foot building. It's an open floor plan. There's no separation between children's, young adults, and the adult sections.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there's a very limited ability, the library says, for it to comply with 710, to reasonably restrict access by people under 18 to these books that may contain material that's harmful to minors under the law. And so with this story gaining national attention last summer, full circle, here we are to this lawsuit. This was not something that was sought out by the Donnelly Library.
Mm-hmm.
This was something that the publishing companies and the authors were putting together, and they kind of canvassed Idaho to find parties that would be willing to join the lawsuit. The Donnelly Library was the only public library in the state that did join on. But you just have to wonder if that story, kind of that adults only policy storyline blowing national last summer, kind of is what led to this.
Mm-hmm. So, Drew, with that said, what happens next in this lawsuit? As we said, it was filed. So, what are the next steps?
Well, gosh, that's what we're all waiting to see, right? A judge is
Yeah.
gonna take the arguments from both sides, and we'll see. The lawsuit asked for 710 to be struck down, so that's certainly what the Donnelly Library, is hoping for, in these publishing companies. But we'll see.
All right. Really appreciate that update, Drew. So, Clark, let's go back to the State House. After weeks of debate, JFAC, the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, has made a decision in regards to state employee raises. So, tell us about this debate and where we are now.
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. This is pretty recent action that just came out of the state capitol building yesterday. And as you mentioned, this has really been weeks or even months in the making, where pay for state employees has been an issue. The latest is that yesterday, the Joint Budget Committee, the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, or JFAC for short, like you said, they finally approved raises for state employees after failing to reach an agreement two different times earlier in January. And I can kind of walk through the raises and what they are, but this applies to a significant amount of people. The state of Idaho is one of the largest employers in the state, as you can imagine, and there are about 25,000 state employees that will be affected by this. And so what the budget committee, what JFAC decided to do is they approved raises that range between a minimum of $1, pardon me, of $1.05 per hour and $1.55 per hour. And so those are the parameters. The state of Idaho is actually going to provide all state agencies and state departments with the full funding to give the $1.55 per hour to all permanent state employees. But what they're going to do, Gemma, is they're going to have the agency directors and the managers award the raises based on merit. So the smallest raise anyone would expect to get is $1.05 an hour. The largest would be $1.55 an hour. This was one of the really things that held up the decision. Legislators had this strong disagreement about whether to give an across-the-board raise to all state employees to recognize that inflation costs have been on the rise, that housing costs across the state of Idaho have been on the rise. And quite frankly, state employee pay has not kept up with inflation or the cost of housing over the last 10 years. What they decided to do is award those based on merit, though, as opposed to across the board. So that's where the range of $1.05 to $1.55 comes into play. And interestingly, if the state agencies don't award the whole $1.55, if they go with $1.05 or something in between, they actually have to return the unused money to the state of Idaho. And so there'll be kind of a decision there for the agency directors and the agency heads. Aside from that, there's going to be a couple of targeted increases for specific job categories. Idaho State Police troopers are going to be receiving raises of up to 8% of their current salary, and IT and engineering staff will receive raises of 4.5%. So there's a couple of different targeted job categories that will get more than the $1.55. But kind of the interesting thing here is this really has been an issue for years. And an administrator with the Idaho Division of Human Resources talked to legislators last year and said two things that really stuck out in my mind. One is that over the last decade, state employee salary increases have been much, much less than the cost of inflation. That was the first thing. The second thing that the HR administrator said was that state employees across the board are so underpaid that they could leave their jobs, do the same job for any other public or private employer in the state of Idaho and expect to get paid more. And the figure that the HR office provided to legislators in December, they talked about over the course of a career, that the difference between what state employees are paid versus what kind of the market rates are could add up to $600,000 or more over the course of a career. And so that's actually led to a high rate of retention. I believe the turnover rate, pardon me, it's a high rate of turnover. But anyways, the turnover rate last year for state employees was almost 20%. It was 19%, Gemma. And what the Division of Human Resources said is there's actually a large cost associated with having to continuously go out and recruit and hire and train all these new state employees that are taking the places of previous state employees who have left their position. They said that there's a high cost of doing that, and it also can affect the services that the state of Idaho provides to the constituents, to the residents of Idaho. So there's a lot of different things going on. The budget committee couldn't reach an agreement in January, and so this decision had actually been put on hold for a couple of weeks until just yesterday when they approved that range of increases and the targeted increases that I mentioned. And just really quickly, what happens next is these raises are going to be built into these bare bones maintenance of operations budgets that apply to all state agencies and all departments. And then those budgets with the raises for state employees will go to the full Idaho House of Representatives and Idaho Senate for consideration. And they're expected to be approved at that point because the maintenance budgets affect all state agencies. And if they are approved, those raises would take effect beginning on July 1st when the new fiscal year begins, Gemma.
Okay, appreciate that update, Clark. Caitlin, some folks in Idaho Falls staged a protest recently. This is in regards to possible immigration raids. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so on Saturday, I think about 350 people is what we counted, showed up to the Broadway Bridge in Idaho Falls to support families who may be targeted by U.S. Immigrations and Custom Enforcement in Idaho after the Trump administration announced that they're going to be enforcing stricter immigration policy. My coworker, David Pace, attended the rally and talked to a bunch of people there. There was one young mother with a baby who spoke about her father being an undocumented farm worker in Idaho and how that's kind of affected their family. He wanted to go to the rally, but he was afraid that he would be arrested and deported if he showed up. He's lived here for 25 years, and she told us kind of a cool story over on that article on eastidahonews.com. It was much bigger than I think a lot of people anticipated. It was super cold, but so many people still showed up. We spoke to the event organizer, Chantel Duran, who um, just kind of told us the reason behind this. You know, she said that Hispanic people and other immigrants are business owners, workers, students, friends, and neighbors. Um, I think one of the most interesting parts of this rally, though, was the fact that Idaho Falls City Councilman Jim Francis attended, which he said he attended to better understand this part of the community and the issue with these policies that are kind of being heightened at the moment. He told us that he's a strong supporter of the community policing in all of its full meaning, and that anybody in this community should be secure from crime against persons and property. He said it's not primarily the responsibility of our police department to look at immigration status, it's to protect all the people who live here. And so my coworker David did a really great job going back into the actual like words of the law for the Idaho Falls Police Department, which says that for immigration violations, officers are encouraged to forego detentions made solely on the basis of a misdemeanor offense when time limitations, availability of personnel, issues of officer safety, communication capabilities, and the potential to obstruct a separate investigation outweigh the need for detention, which is something I think a lot of people didn't know was the actual policy for them. Um, but it was a really big rally here. It garnered a lot
Mhm.
of attention, and you can kind of tell that there's a community of people who are really worried about their family members being taken and people being separated. And so
Mhm.
I think they have more rallies scheduled for the future, and we will continue to cover those.
Well, and I think, Caitlin, folks, maybe who live in Boise or who new to this, or who are new to this area, may not recognize or realize what a big agricultural community East Idaho is, and
Right.
and how and probably how many undocumented workers are living and working in agriculture over there.
Right. And we've been getting a lot of news tips saying that there's been, ice raids in Pocatello and ice raids all over East Idaho. And we check all of those news tips, and we haven't been able to confirm that any of that's been happening. According to the Bonneville County Democrat chairwoman, Miranda Marquis here, it's the second largest demonstration she's seen in Idaho Falls in the last 10 years, which just kind of shows that this is a really big, people have a lot of really strong emotions about this. And we, as you said, are a huge agricultural part of the state. And this is something that could
Mhm.
really, really affect us if ice raids do go forward. Although we did receive releases from Bannock County and Blaine County recently that said that they've also been hearing rumors that there were ice raids, and they've said that nothing like that has happened so far. There hasn't been any large scale operations in the area. And it's kind of right now just social media rumors and hype,
Mm.
but we're keeping pretty vigilant just in case something does happen.
So, Logan, the Senate once again passed an anti-swatting bill. Now, for people who aren't familiar with this, can you explain to us what swatting is?
Absolutely. Swatting, the term refers to SWAT teams, special weapons and tactics units, that police departments use to respond to very serious threats. And so this phenomenon has grown over the last several years, and it started online, but it has slowly crept into the real world. And this is a situation where, if we're familiar with doxing, that is another kind of internet pranked into harassment term where people find people's personal information from documents.
Hmm.
That's where doxing comes from. And spread that information online for the purpose of others being able to track them down and harass them. Swatting is kind of the next logical step after doxing, in which someone calls in a false police report with the intention of that being sending police to someone's house to respond to this report, and when there's actually no actual instance of violence. And so this,
Oh.
I referenced this being something that originated on the internet. It was kind of the earliest instances are people who play video games and live stream their performance or their playing online. And it got to the point where some people in their audiences would call the police claiming there was a hostage situation at this person's house, and then the police would come, and then the people in the audience would get kind of a sick pleasure out of watching the police raid this person's house, who ostensibly they were just watching them play video games online. And this has become a growing phenomenon. There was a terrible instance back in Tennessee a couple years ago where one individual was being harassed so many times, and police came to his house so many times. Eventually, I believe this gentleman passed away from the effects of the stress. And so this is a
Oh my
growing
gosh.
phenomenon across the country that Senator Tammy Nichols from Middleton is looking to address. This is the second year this bill has passed through the Senate. And she says swatting is not just a prank, it is a criminal act that wastes police resources, and also puts people in danger. If police are showing up to someone's house expecting to deal with an active shooter and it's just someone at home not expecting police to show up, it can cause really severe consequences.
So what happens next then in regards to moving this bill forward? Because as you just said, Logan, this bill came about last year as well, but this is the second time we're seeing this.
Yeah, this is the second time we're seeing this. It's passed the Senate the second time and been referred to the House Judiciary Committee. I haven't spoken with the chairman over there, so I'm not sure when it's scheduled for a hearing, if it is. But if it passed, it would create in law a felony or misdemeanor crime for maliciously or recklessly submitting false reports of violence or emergencies. For the purpose of harassing people. Idaho Code, we already have a law where you can be penalized for making a false explosive report. So calling in a false bomb threat is already something that people can be penalized for in law. But submitting a false report of like a gunman or a hostage situation or something like that is not covered. So this would create a parallel section in statute, depending on if any harm was caused or any property damage, or if someone did die as a result of one of these false reports. There's kind of a range of penalties between $5,000 for the lowest level. If one of these false reports caused the death of any person, the person responsible for the report could face up to 10 years in prison if this becomes the law.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you for that update. So, Emma, some Idaho charter schools just received some big grant money from the federal charter school program. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so Idaho charter schools received just under $7 million in grants from the federal charter school program. And those grants are going to help those schools provide almost 1,900 seats. So the grants go to Idaho's Building on Success Future Excellence program, which is administered by Bloom, which is a nonprofit. Those grants will only be issued if the United States Department of Education releases those funds, which is a bit up in the air after federal grants were frozen and then unfrozen. There was a court order that blocked the freezing of those funds, but then the Trump administration also rescinded the administrative order or the executive order that instituted the freeze. So that's a bit up in the air. But if those funds do come through, they'll go to 4 new charter schools. So $2 million will go to Alturas Academy North in Rigby. And that school is set to open in 2026. And then another $2 million will go to an Elevate Academy location in Twin Falls, which will also open in 2026. And then $2 million will go to Valor Classical Academy in Kuna, which is set to open in 2026 as well. And then lastly, Hollister Charter School in Hollister is going to get $800,000, and they're planning to open next school year.
Okay, but as you mentioned, this is all dependent on what happens with the freezing of funds, and I guess even what happens with the Department of Education, because that is potentially on the chopping block right now as well.
Yeah, it all really is dependent on what happens federally. Obviously, these are ongoing grant programs. So this was all in process before the Trump administration took over last month. So still a little up in the air, but these schools are all pretty far along in the process of opening. They've been authorized by either the Idaho Charter Commission or by local school districts.
Okay, well, appreciate that update very much. Logan, let me come back to you. Can you talk to us about a recent decision by the Idaho Supreme Court that it reverted a child pornography case?
It did, yes. We'll get away from the state house from this one, and I appreciate that we're on the radio during mealtime, so I'll leave the graphic details out of it. But this
Okay.
is a case up in northern Idaho where a couple years ago, an individual from Spokane was accused of stalking one of the police dispatch workers who worked for the Post Falls Police Department. He had shown up at the police department and asked for her business card. He was spotted multiple times in her neighborhood with a camera taking photos on the street. So police arrested the man and obtained a warrant to search his devices that he had in his possession at the time. They were looking for photographs that would support their stalking charge, and they found much more on his phone than they were bargaining for. The man was released, and so they coordinated with him to return his phone at City Hall. They were meeting with him at City Hall instead of the police department because he had been trespassed from the police department. He was not allowed to come back there and interact with that dispatch worker anymore. So police met the man in Post Falls at the City Hall, arrested him for the content they had found on his phone, and then impounded his car, which was properly parked in a spot at City Hall. Once they impounded the car, they did what's called an inventory search, where it's a standard procedure where police take everything out and catalog it.
Mhm.
In that search, they found a laptop as well as some storage devices. And based on what they had found on his phone, they got another search warrant to search those other devices and found thousands and thousands of more images. Just terrible situation. Um, so this man was convicted and sent to prison for 10 years. Now, however, his case was appealed to the Idaho Supreme Court, and this is the decision that just came down last week. Because this man's car was properly parked and the police in Post Falls did not show they had a legitimate community caretaking reason to impound the car, um, here in America, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects us from unreasonable search and seizure. So the police are only allowed to take your stuff if they have a legitimate reason for doing so. The police argued it was part of their standard arrest procedure to impound the car at the time that this man was arrested. But the Supreme Court has ruled that in order to impound a car like that, you have to have a reason, like it's violating a traffic ordinance or it's blocking traffic, or you can't just impound it on just as part of routine procedure. And so the court ruled
Mhm.
because of what's called the exclusionary rule, this extra evidence was gathered illegally, so they should not have been able to show what was found in the car in the courtroom, and it was materials from the laptop and those devices that were the key piece of evidence in this conviction. And so the man's attorney had moved to exclude that evidence in court, which was turned down by the lower district court before his conviction. So as you said, the Supreme Court of the state has vacated that conviction and overturned the denial of the motion to exclude evidence, which means this case is going to go back to the first district court in Kootenai County, and the court will have to pick it up again from the first search warrant where they found the first materials on his phone. That was legal and that was fine, but they're going to have
Mhm.
to rerun the case likely without what was found in the car.
Wow. Okay. Well, I really appreciate that update, Logan. Clark, can you fill us in about a bill that was recently introduced that, if passed, would create a media shield law? And I guess let's start with what is a media shield law and why do we need something like this potentially?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. Thanks. I appreciate the chance to talk about it. Idaho is one of only 10 states in the country that don't have a media shield law. And what a media shield law does is it protects sources who provide confidential information to journalists. And I'll just read you a part of this new bill. If you'd like to follow this bill in its journey, it's House Bill 158. It was just introduced earlier this week. And part of what it says is, quote, no person engaged in journalistic activities shall be compelled to disclose in any legal proceeding, any trial before any court, or before any jury, the source of any information procured or obtained or published in a newspaper, a print publication, a digital news outlet, a radio, or a TV broadcast station. And so what we've seen is an increase really in the last couple of years with local Idaho news organizations being served with subpoenas where either an attorney or an individual is seeking to force a court to force a news organization to diverge the source of a confidential information. It's happened a couple of times recently. One involved EastIdahoNews.com, where they were forced to last year play a confidential conversation between a reporter and a source in court. And there was another example last year that involved our friends at Boise Dev here locally, where a source actually threatened to ask a judge to hold them in contempt of court, which could carry a 30-day jail sentence and a $5,000 fine if they didn't disclose this email that was referenced in a story. Boise Dev was actually able to fight that subpoena, but they said it cost them thousands of dollars to do so and a lot of staff time, and the information was already available through other sources. And so what this would do, I talked to Melissa Davlin, who is a friend of the show, and she's the president of the Idaho Press Club, and she actually got involved after a couple of legislators reached out and they wanted to help these news organizations that were dealing with these subpoenas. Melissa reached out to the Committee to Protect the Free Press, and she actually modeled Idaho's new bill after laws that have been in place in decades for Alabama and Kentucky. And when I talked to Melissa about it, she talked about how the First Amendment does provide protections for a free press, which is our ability to report on the government freely and hold the powerful accountable. But that can be really difficult if sources don't have confidence that the information that they share with a journalist could be safe and secured and protected. And so that's what this bill would do. It would make it so that journalists don't have to disclose the identity of people who provide confidential information. And Melissa told me that would protect both the local news outlets in Idaho, and it would also protect those sources that provide that confidential information. And I know all the reporters on the call today, most everything we do, we really prefer to have on the record sources, but there are a handful of times, and you can maybe think about a case involving maybe government corruption or something where a source may have confidential information that there's a public good, but they may be afraid to disclose it because maybe they could be fired for doing so. And when you think about maybe one of the most famous cases of a confidential source in America, at least, I think about the Watergate break-in, and I think about the Washington Post and that source Deep Throat. And for years, they were able to protect the identity of the source Deep Throat. But it turns out that he was actually a Twin Falls native, an Idahoan named Mark Felt. And at the end of his life, he chose to share his story publicly in a Vanity Fair article talking about it. And so it's kind of an interesting situation. Like I said, Idaho's only one of 10 states that don't have a media shield law. And right now, really one of the only ways that journalists in Idaho can really swear to protect a source is if they would be prepared to accept a contempt charge, serve jail time, and pay a fine to protect their source, protect the source of that confidential information. What this bill would do is just say that journalists don't have to go to jail to protect the source, that a court cannot compel confidential information from being disclosed. Now, this bill was just introduced this week, Gemma, and so it's at the very beginning of its legislative journey. It's House Bill 158, and there was no opposition to it being introduced earlier this week, but legislators had several questions about it. It's a new topic for Idaho, and so some legislators asked about whether this is absolutely necessary, given that we already have the First Amendment, and other legislators asked about if this bill would protect organizations that act like legitimate news organizations, but in fact are doing something other than that. And the bill kind of talks about legitimate journalistic activities. And so it's not written to protect a specific news organization or a specific individual. It's really all about legitimate journalistic activities. And so that bill was referred to the House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee, and that's cleared the way for it to have a full public hearing, which could be as early as next week. But it's the very beginning of the journey for this particular bill, Gemma.
All right. Appreciate that, Clark. So, Drew, tell us about some changes that are coming to a popular marina in McCall. There's a Texas firm apparently that's buying a majority stake in the Mile High Arena. Can you first give us a little bit of background though, on because there's an expansion plan, right, for this marina, and that started what in 2021?
That's right, Gemma. And so finally, after, gosh, it had been 4 years, last summer, the McCall City Council signed off on the plans. It was a split vote, 3-2, to move forward with that expansion project. It would add 90 boat slips to Mile High Marina, which currently has 165 slips. And it would also replace, there's currently a log breakwater, kind of a rudimentary, archaic thing almost, surrounding the marina to protect it from waves. And so that would actually be replaced with what's called a breakwater attenuator system, um, which would be installed on the underside of floating docks. And these floating docks would be public. So it would create some 1,000 feet of public floating dock that anybody would be able to go out and enjoy. There's a couple 30 by 30 platforms out in the lake that would have benches and some shaded seating. Um, so that's kind of the expansion plans. These were kind of hotly debated before the McCall City Council over these last couple of years, mostly on account of water quality concerns and carrying capacity of the lake. There's the constant debate was, well, will it add, 90 more boats to the lake, or will it just be 90 existing users who now won't have to trailer in and out every time they want to go boating? And eventually, the council, like I said, voted 3-2, um, allowed the project to move forward, and that's kind of what led to this agreement with this Texas firm, RCP. It's Resilient Capital Partners. They're headquartered down in Dallas. And the deal's not final yet. They're kind of in those closing contingencies. But here soon, yes, they would become the majority owners of the marina.
Emma, tell us about the state recently revoking 6 teaching certificates for ethics violations. So, what happened here?
Yeah, so the Professional Standards Commission is the body that revoked these certificates. And so it's a volunteer board that has 18 teachers, school administrators, and other higher education officials. And they enforce the state's code of ethics, and they can approve, suspend, revoke teaching and administrative certificates in the state. And so it was kind of a big meeting on Thursday. They took 19 disciplinary actions, which the chair, Angela Gilman, said was a record number for one meeting. And I could give some examples of what's going to cause a certificate to be revoked. So, for example, Matthew Felshaw in Bonneville School District, he was a former high school teacher, and he received a suspended sentence in April after being convicted of felony injury to a child after he sexually assaulted a 5 to 6-year-old girl. And so that is what caused his certificate to be suspended. Quite a few of the, or not suspended, revoked. So quite a few of the revocations were due to criminal charges or convictions. So then there are other levels of action. So a certificate can be suspended, or a teacher can have a letter of reprimand put into their file.
Okay, so as you said, though, they looked at 19 and revoked 6, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, appreciate that update. Caitlin, let's head back over to East Idaho. Tell us about this beef and bison processing plant that's been charged with some misdemeanors, and it has to do with what? It's some really bad smells coming out of this?
Yeah, you pretty much got it. So there is a beef and bison processing plant in Idaho Falls. It's kind of over closer to like Iona, if you are familiar with the area. But they were recently charged with a misdemeanor for public nuisance because over the last, I would say, 2 years, locals have been complaining about a really, really bad smell coming from the property. And then more recently, people have been complaining about a really bad smell coming from some of the lift stations that are closest to the sewer lines that Intermountain Packing uses. And it's a really big processing plant. It's 66,000 square feet. And it, I believe, was built in 2020. I think it opened in 2023.
Mhm.
So essentially, it got so bad around town that a Idaho Falls police officer had to go over to multiple different places. The city department, they had to meet with the sewer department. They had to go over to Intermountain Packing and the wastewater superintendent they spoke to, and they just kind of determined that it was kind of an unlivable situation. Multiple locals, especially people that live over in that area, wrote their own affidavits to the court, kind of explaining their experiences with the smell and how it has negatively like affected their lives. There's a really popular breakfast restaurant over there that people are avoiding because it smells so bad over there, and I can attest to the fact that it spreads over pretty much the whole town.
Oh.
And it's pretty bad. One of the affidavits mentioned it was a man wrote it that owns rental properties over kind of, I would say, probably like a mile or so from Intermountain Packing. And one of his tenants informed him that it smelled really bad outside and that he didn't want to be outside. So he was really concerned that his rental properties are going to lose value due to the smell.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting and important to mention is that the officer did interview David Adams, the CEO of Intermountain Packing, who kind of explained that he doesn't believe Intermountain Packing is completely at fault for the bad smell. So David Adams explained that the wastewater they use, the pipes run in the area of Shelley Street and Ada Avenue, where people often smell these really bad smells. And it's only one of 4 pipes that all join in that area, which is why he doesn't think it is completely responsible. But Intermountain Packing did pay $75,000 for basically a machine that aerates the liquid in the sewers to help with the smell, and a bunch of carbon filters that the city installed. He also kind of explained that after animals are slaughtered at the facility, this is really gross, and I know it's lunchtime, so I'll try and kind of like tone it down a little bit. After the animals are slaughtered at the facility, they kind of like separate the solids and the fats, and blood and wastewater are put in the sewers. And so they actually do haul away the solids and the fats from the facility, and the particles that are still there in the wastewater, and they're heated water. And so it can cause kind of a bad smell, but the issue is that it doesn't really seem like anybody really knows how to fix it. Nobody really knows what to do because it's been going on for a pretty long time. And so right now, DEQ has gotten involved, but unfortunately they can't measure odor to tell them that to tell them they have to stop doing something. And so lots of people are concerned that it might be the exhaust. Lots of people are concerned that maybe semi trucks with the solids and fats aren't being moved quickly. But the possible consequences for this, I believe, is a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. So Intermountain Packing did respond to us when we wrote this story and said that they were surprised by the city's decision to file criminal proceedings because they've been working with the city to try and fix the issue. And that they just hope the city is going to reconsider the criminal charges and work with them to fix the issue rather than threaten a local business is their view on it. So this isn't the first time we've reported on this either. It's a pretty big issue in East Idaho right now. So we're going to keep on it and see what happens.
Wow. Well, really appreciate that. It's very interesting. So appreciate the update on that. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We have been speaking with Drew Dodson, editor and reporter for the Valley Lookout, Logan Finney with Idaho Reports, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, and Caitlin Hart with East Idaho News, along with Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun. I also want to give a big thank you to our senior producer, Samantha Wright, and our assistant producer, Hannah Gardosky. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
Whether Boise State Public Radio brings a smile to your day, some inspiration, or a greater connection to Idaho and the world, we're proud to be here with you. Federal funding, about $1.60 per person annually, helps keep these trusted services strong and accessible to everyone in our community. Learn how you can safeguard local public media stations like ours by visiting protectmypublicmedia.org.